Greetings and welcome to the Cerebral Women Art Talks podcast. I'm Phyllis Hollis, your host. As an extension of my Instagram page, Cerebral Women, this podcast offers insights into the visual art world. I interview artists, mainly artists of color and female artists who will freely articulate what inspires their creativity. In addition, you'll hear interesting perspectives from dedicated art professionals who work with artists and the art institutions that feature them. I'm confident that collectively, these individuals will indeed stimulate your mind as they do our eyes. Please know these interviews are conducted in my Manhattan apartment, so please forgive the background sounds of city life. Welcome to the Cerebral Women Art Talks podcast. This episode features Amanda Coulson. She has worked for 3 decades as a scholar, critic, curator, and cultural producer, having collaborated with artists and institutions, private and corporate colleagues in the U.S., Europe, and various sites in the Caribbean. A dual national, the Bahamas and U.S., she grew up between London, Nassau, and New York, where she studied for her master's degree at the Institute of Fine Arts at NYU, and started her career at the old master dealers, Wildenstein Sons, going on to work in various art galleries in London, Paris, and Milan. Noting a lack of platforms for galleries representing emerging art, in 2005 she co-founded the Volta Art Fairs, which take place annually in New York and Basel, Switzerland. In 2011, she was invited home to the Bahamas to be executive director at the National Art Gallery of the Bahamas, NAGB, where her focus was on increasing global awareness of the contemporary Caribbean art scene and on expanding the capacity and reach of the NAGB through a rigorous combination of capital works, collaborative projects, and the building of strong inter-island, regional, and international networks. She stepped down from this role in 2021 after a decade at the helm. Amanda is the founding partner at Turn, a new Nassau-based gallery operated by 3 Bahamian women whose aim is to support Bahamian and Caribbean artists in telling their own stories. Please visit cerebralwomen.com for Amanda's expanded bio and enjoy this episode. Amanda, welcome to my Cerebral Women Art Talks podcast. I'm looking forward to our conversation.
Me too. Thank you so much for having me.
My pleasure. When in your life did you recognize your love of the visual arts?
I recognized it actually when I was very luckily living in Paris, of all places, a place that's easy to fall in love with the arts. I'd been around a lot of art. My family was very, we went to the theater, we went to the ballet, went to museums. So it was always sort of around me, but I'd never considered it sort of the focal part of my life until I was at college. I went to college in Paris. I had been at a sort of very strange situation. I was at an all-boys school in the UK where I was one of the few girls to go to this all-boys public school. It was very posh. And so I was kind of put into classes like sort of Greek and Latin and things that were like, what am I ever going to do in life with these? And I did a year abroad in New York, actually, between high school and college. And that's where I first got the inkling. I was very much working in fashion. I was a young 17-year-old. We're living, like, this is the early 80s in New York, clubbing, fashion, and art was kind of part of that. And I was lucky enough to meet people like Jean-Michel, like Keith Haring. But it was just, I was young and I'm like, oh, this is so exciting. This is parties. I wasn't taking it sort of seriously. So I went to college, and the reason I picked Paris is I thought I had to get out of the British system. I had to get out of the kind of very rigid sort of academic, old boy sort of network system that I was sort of being pushed into. I think my parents would have liked me to be a lawyer. And, this is, again, we're talking about the early 80s. So it's kind of like to be a woman competing in a man's world. It was like, we have to turn you into a boy. And so they were like, yes, you should go to a boys' school, be a lawyer. And my year in New York just opened up all these other possibilities. I was modeling, I was working in a club, I was like meeting all these art people. But again, I was still young and I hadn't really. And so when I went to college, I was just studying. I thought, let me get out of the system. Let me go to the American University in Paris. where I was able to do a little bit of this and a little bit of that until I declared a major. I went as a European studies major. So I was studying philosophy, literature, history, all things that I'd always been interested in. And through that, I discovered history of art. And I had phenomenal teachers who both had gone to the Institute of Fine Arts in New York, which is part of NYU, which is where I eventually went to get my master's. And they were just extraordinary teachers. We also were exposed to so much actual art, like not just in Paris, not just at the Louvre, but every time, let's say we were doing French Gothic architecture. We'd get in a bus, we'd drive around France, we'd look at French Gothic architecture. When we were doing early Renaissance painting, we'd get in a bus, we'd drive to Florence. This is the beauty about living in Europe, and the American college made it very accessible. So I saw so much. I was traveling to Amsterdam to see Rubens and, Rembrandt, and I was traveling to Italy, and this was all just part of, the classes, and they were very small classes, 10, 12 people. Not just these American colleges that are, in the States with 200 people in your 101 class. And we formed very close bonds. There's people from my year that are all still in the art world from that period. Simon Lee, I opened Simon Lee Gallery. Rebecca Kamke, who's got a gallery in Athens. And Rebecca Evel, who's an advisor, and she has a gallery in Ohio. And we all just kind of fell in love with this, the history of art, really the kind of passion of writing about it, studying it. And that's where I became kind of serious about I didn't know what I wanted to do in the art world at that time, but that's when I knew that it was the thing that would carry me through life.
And when did you realize that you wanted to be a gallerist, that you wanted to work with artists, showcase artists?
Well, that came late. So my husband always jokes that I've done every job in the art world, and now I just need to become an artist in my 70s, and then I would have done full circle. So when I left grad school, I was really a very traditional kind of academic. I thought I'd work in a museum. I wanted to write meaningful tomes on artists. I also, at college and in grad school, where I had really been active was actually in the medieval and Renaissance. It's so far away from contemporary art. Except I have to say medieval and contemporary have quite a few alignments, but we won't go into that. So I thought I'd be really sort of an academic and go into a university or go into a museum. And I had the opportunity to sort of intern at the Met very briefly I went to the Institute of Fine Arts, which is part of NYU. And then I got a job working at Wildenstein right after grad school, and which is an old master dealer, used to be in the Upper East Side on 68th Street. Lizzie Diane bought that building, and they have their gallery now. But it was very, very, again, very traditional. And I was working in the provenance department. I was doing research. And that world just was not my cup of tea at all. I didn't like the auction, having to go to the auctions. The working for the Wildensteins was a very strange experience. They were sort of tie your hair back, don't talk too much, wear pantyhose. I just felt it was sort of very old school. I loved the painting, but I didn't love the world. And so I actually just went left field. I was married very young, and my husband was an actor. We moved to LA, and I actually worked in the film business for a while. Mm-hmm. And I thought, this isn't for me. I did all this art thing, but maybe there's something else I'm going to do that's visual or that is about artistic practice. We're talking about the late 80s, early 90s. There was nothing happening in LA almost. And I worked in the film business, but again, everything I've done at every step in my career has kind of fed the next thing. So that's where I learned how to manage a budget. That's where I learned how to production manage. And those were all skills that came in extremely useful later on. When I left LA, I did start working at a gallery. My friend Simon Lee was opening his gallery in London. It was called 11 Duke Street back then. This is again very early 90s. And I worked with him very briefly. And then I went to work for a gallery in Milan. I'd moved there for another reason. We don't need to get into my love life. But anyway, an Italian man got me to Italy. And it was a photography gallery. And actually, why I'd been living in LA, I started collecting photography. I was working in the film business. I was not making insignificant money for a young person my age. And I started collecting photography. And it was through photography that I really started getting interested in contemporary art. So I went to work at the gallery in Milan. And so I was working with a range of photographers from, vintage work to contemporary work. We did a show, we did a show with David LaChapelle. It was crazy. He came out with his whole entourage. with Amanda Lepore, and she was naked all the time. And I just, but I suppose that's when I started first like working with artists. But I always really still loved the research and the writing. Like I always felt like I was less of a salesperson and more into writing about the work and contextualizing the work. And I love to speak about art. I think that's where my strength has been. So that's always what I was doing in the gallery context. And then from that gallery, I got a job working for a magazine in Italy called Tema Celeste, which was a really great contemporary art magazine that was published for quite a long time, really beautiful. And my mother was a writer. Like I told you, I grew up around art and theater and everything. My mother was a writer, and I guess writing's always been part of my passion. And so I started working in this magazine, and I loved doing that. And I got to work with artists that way. A lot of interviews, a lot of editing texts. I was a translator of all the magazines, the Italian to English, and then started editing the English language version, which was then published separately. So I've really I was in publishing. So I went from working in galleries to working in a publishing house. And then when I ended up living in Germany, another part of my love life you don't need to know about. But I went out to Germany and I was living there, and that's where I started writing really a lot. And I started writing more about, shows and artists. And when I was living in Germany, I started writing for, Frieze and ARTNews and Modern Painters and lots of magazines. And I was an editor at large in Europe because I just had the skill of being an English language writer. I always say if I'd been living in London, I probably wouldn't have had a great career writing, but because I was in Europe and art magazines normally can't afford to then pay for a translation as well. The fact that I was an English writing art critic living in Europe really gave me a lot of work. And so I was writing a lot, living in Frankfurt, traveling a lot around Europe, going to fairs, going to, spaces. My now husband, at the time he was my boyfriend, had a gallery. So we traveled a lot and I did that. So I was writing, did some essays for monographic exhibitions in Frankfurt, got to interview really interesting artists, from young up and coming artists like Julian Schnabel. I remember landing that interview and I was so terrified. And he was so nice. And so again, all of this, I'd never really thought about. My husband was running a gallery. I just thought, oh, what a nightmare. I never want to do that. And then we started Volta, right? So that then happened. So he was thinking about how to do Art Basel, and other gallery friends of ours were thinking about it too. And Kavi Gupta was one of them, and Friedrich Loch from Berlin was another. And we were all sitting around in Cologne and 2002, wondering how any of them would ever get into Art Basel. And we had this idea to start our own little fair. And this is really Lista existed. And I think NADA was maybe 1 year old, but there was not this kind of culture of satellite fairs that there is now. And we founded Volta. We thought that would be a 3-year project. We thought it would just be, we do it for a few years until they got into the main fair kind of thing. And it just turned into a big business. And I kind of joke around. They always say, people used to ask me, how did you become the executive director of Volta? And I'd say, well, 3 guys had the idea and one of them had a wife.
That's cute.
I just ended up organizing everything. And they had their galleries to run. And, Volta became, quite a big business and was bought by the Merchandise Mart. We became partners with the Armory. And, I was the executive director through all of that. So I did that for a good 15 years. And that was not working so closely with artists. And so I got a little far away from the kind of work I enjoyed doing, which was writing and talking to artists and being around artists. I was dealing more with gallerists and dealers, but I did try to every fair we did. We had a lot of outdoor projects, in the New York Fair, we had this special section. The first year, I think Derek Adams curated it before he became his huge persona. And the year after, actually, Micheline Thomas curated it. A lot of artists now that are very much sought after had their first show really at Volta in New York, like Deborah Roberts and Didier Williams. I mean, he was right out of Yale, so it was still a way for me to be kind of following what was happening, watching young artists. And then it's at the same time, I had this kind of invitation to come back to the Bahamas where I'm originally from. So the museum here was looking for an executive director. And at this point, I was the executive director of Volta. I'd been doing it for 10 years. And it made sense for me at the time to come back home. It was an exciting idea to be part of the nation building that's still happening in our very young country. The Bahamas is only 51 years old. My father was getting old. He still lived here. And at the time, a lot of people didn't know I was Bahamian. I just stopped telling people because you end up having really very stupid conversations about like, do you ride a dolphin to work or something, and you're just like, oh God, do you live in a mud hut? Like really, like you're just like, really? So I just, I was always kind of, I think, ambiguous about people thought maybe I was English or maybe I was Irish or maybe I was American or maybe I was South African. Like people can never figure my accent out either. But it was great. So I came home and I did that. I was the executive director of the National Museum for 10 years, which is another whole. So through all of that, I never thought about opening a gallery. But as I rose up the ranks and kind of administration, like through both Volta and then the museum, I just realized that I didn't enjoy doing that I wasn't like, again, it takes you further away from artists. So the more you go up the ranks, when we started Volta, I was dealing with gallerists, but they were representing a lot of young artists. I still got to do projects with them. We had really special projects. We would do editions. We would do, like I still was in touch with artists enough. And there was sort of a creative outlet. As Volta got bigger, it became less fun and more admin. And so the opportunity to come home was great. I think at the first 6 years of the institution was amazing because it was really a very small institution, almost like a community center practically. And so building that out was really great. And I got to know a lot of the artists here. I actually had my own radio show. A bit like this. I know. It was called Blank Canvas and it was on the national radio station. And I did it every week for 8 years and it was great. And I was talking to artists all the time. And so, that was really in learning about the region and other, what was happening around the whole Caribbean. But again, I just realized that the further up you go in any kind of structure, you just become a manager and an administrator and you start dealing with budgets and HR. And I just realized that, I was so far from art. I was so far from working with artists and talking to artists and writing about artists. And so when, again, the time at the museum just became clear, it clarified for me that 10-year number was going to be my exit. At that point, that's when opening a gallery made sense. That's a very long answer to your question.
Yeah, but there's a second part to it. Well, it continues, I should say. So what kind of relationship do you prefer to have with artists? You obviously missed working with them.
I did miss working with artists. I realized what I enjoy about working with artists is being around creative people, helping them bring projects to fruition and writing about them. And those are my kind of passions. And through my work at the museum, I really realized that the Caribbean as a whole, but specifically my own country, just didn't have an ecosystem. There was nowhere for artists to practice, to play, to make mistakes, to learn how to be an artist beyond the studio. Like an artist, sure, there's a studio practice, but then there's everything else. There's all the putting on a show and delivering work and just talking about it. And there's a lack through the region of kind of professionalization in that sense. And so that's why we felt a gallery was the right thing to do because, artists would want to come, they'd come to the museum and they'd say, oh, I want to have a solo show here. But they really wanted to have a solo show to be exposed and to sell work.
Right.
And I would say, well, first of all, that's not my job at the museum. Or they'd want me to introduce them to curators or get them a gallery in New York. And I'd be like, that's not my job as an executive director of a museum. That's even like ethically questionable. But if I would say to them, well, you'll get a show here when you've had a 20-year career, where are they going to have a 20-year career in the Bahamas when there's no galleries? And so I think over the last 15 years, the whole community has really thought about that and different galleries have kind of popped up. And that's when we felt a gallery at the level that Turn is functioning at was missing here. And that was something that we could do that would be of service to artists. And specifically because traditionally, and this is probably true for artists from small towns in the middle of America too, but to be a practicing artist in the Bahamas, you had to leave. You had to leave home. That was period. That was if you wanted to really have a career to speak of. And that's extremely unfortunate because a lot of the nourishment that artists are getting from their community or from their surroundings exists here. And so we wanted to create a platform so that artists could choose to live and work in the Caribbean and still have representation. And also to have representation that's from the region, that is not foreign galleries and no disrespect to them, but being like, oh yeah, we need a Black artist or we need a Caribbean artist. Let's get one in our program. But to really have representation from the region and to be able to say we can do things for ourselves. And I think that leads to the question of my relationship with the artists that we work with are all artists that I've had like long and deep relationships with. And the way I enjoy to work with artists is really to get to know them. I always say that I think a gallery artist relationship is really a bit like a marriage. And you have to be able to have difficult conversations. You have to trust each other. You know, you're going to have a lot of back and forth. You have to be able to sit with that. You have to be able to have that very close relationship of like advice. Sometimes it's advice you don't want to hear. Sometimes it's advice you do want to hear. And same for the artists. So I think it's beyond I think there's been a lot of talk about sort of community. There is a community, but I think it's more than just friends. Like, oh, we're all friends hanging out. I think it's different to that because I have a lot of friends, but I have one husband. And it's a relationship that takes time and takes a lot of care. And so I think the relationship I try to have, that I enjoy having with my artists is one where, or artists that I enjoy working with, is one where we've really taken the time to get to know each other, where we've had a lot of meals together, where we've talked about things outside of their practice, where we really have an understanding of each other.
Yeah.
And I think that's the kind of relationship that I enjoy having. So I would say, are they all my friends? I'm not calling them up to talk to them about my issues. They're not my friends that way, but they're people that I respect enormously and that I have a very deep bond to and that I probably do love, that I really love.
And how do you like to work with collectors?
With collectors, it's difficult when you're running a gallery. It changes a lot, right? Because obviously there's a pressure on you because you have people that are relying on you for their livelihood. But I think it's in a way it's the same as I prefer a slow burn and getting to know. And that's what I think was lucky for the gallery is that because of Volta, which I did in the end for 15 years. I mean, that is a long time. I developed a lot of relationships with collectors through the fair. And so when I opened a gallery, I already had quite deep relationships, which helped us in the early years. I think with collectors, it's very similar. Like you want to know, I mean, yes, does someone walk in at a fair and just buy something off the wall and I don't know them? Of course. Yeah, of course. But like when you're talking about a real, like the longevity of relationships and of collectors that will follow your program and really support you, I think those are slow burn relationships where you meet people over time at various fairs, various events. Again, you take the time to, have meals, you chat on the phone or you WhatsApp occasionally. So I think it's a bit the same thing because at the end of the day, collectors very often they're trusting you. So it's the same trust building that happens with the artist is that, they want to know what your vision is as a dealer. They want to understand why it is you're doing what you do. Are you doing it to just like make the next paycheck? Or are you doing it for a different reason? And so I think I think it's all relationship building, whether it's collectors or artists. It's really about sort of deep relationships that makes them satisfying. So yeah, that would be another long answer.
So the artists you work with are all different colors. Do you feel that Hispanic, Latinx, Black art, Asian art, do you feel any of that can be defined?
I mean, yes and no. Obviously, we're always trying to, right? And I think a lot of people think turn it's a black gallery. But yeah, it's not because, when you come from the Caribbean, you do see things quite differently because, that idea of, I'm not about to say as, a white Bahamian that race doesn't exist. Of course it exists. It's deeply entrenched here, but in a very different way than it is in the United States. So to say that we're a gallery that only represents an artist based on, we work with Caribbean artists and that can mean anything. That can mean anything, right? So trying to define what Caribbean is extremely hard. Trying to define what Latinx, because again, the trauma of this region and of so many of these marginalized spaces where we're trying to put people in these boxes is that there was colonization, whether that be by another race or another religion. And the lines are never hard, right? They're very fuzzy. And here, in the Caribbean, putting someone in one little, everyone's got multiple boxes because our history is so complex. So we have families that they're white, they're black, they're South American, they're African, they're, European, because the slave trade and the history of the region was just all about movement. So yes, of course you can say, we all have an idea of what, Latinx means. We all have an idea of what, but then, even black, that's the term, like black art, what is that? There's African art, there's African American, because the Caribbean experience is absolutely not the African American experience. So, what does that even mean? So I think it's very hard to have hard and fast definitions on a lot of those. And, I was just having this conversation with the curator at Museo del Barrio, because they were, again, very much a museum that was about Latinx, but there's a lot of Latin people in the Caribbean. And a lot of Latin people who are of color, like who have African ancestry and that are not the same, same genetically as European Spaniards that came over. And so, again, like where do you draw that line? It's a very difficult line to draw.
And what do you feel is the purpose of art?
Wow, that's a big question. It's really, to see the things that we don't see. I think artists see the world in a way that the rest of us normies don't. I think they see solutions and possibilities and all kinds of things. And I think in a way art is there to help us see the unseen. And I don't just mean that, only spiritually, but I think in all kinds of ways. I think it's living in the moment in a way. Sometimes it's capturing a moment. Sometimes it's asking you to slow down. Sometimes it's asking you to see something in a way that you wouldn't have looked at it because it's a different perspective. So I think what art does is invite us to see what we don't see normally, or think about what we don't think about normally. And I think its role is to keep us, art is frankly what makes us human. I think we're not just animals about eating and procreating, because we have this capacity for empathy and seeing and thinking beyond the merely physical. So I feel like that's what art does, and that's its purpose as kind of a unifier and a connector and an explainer and a conversation starter, all those things, a way to get us out of our everyday and out of our boxes, out of our little boxes where we separate ourselves from other people and understand each other.
What is the methodology behind your curatorial choices?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, at the gallery specifically at Turn, these are all mostly artists that, again, we've really developed through the museum. Let's say the artist we have opening this week, Laisho Johnson. I worked with him at the NHB at the museum in 2015 or something. So before, the gallery opened in 2021, I already had a long 6-year relationship with him beforehand. So a lot of them are just the artists we work with. And we try to think about, a lot of the work we do is about thinking through our situation as Caribbean people. So I think the curatorial choices are very much about conversations we want to have, things we want other people to think about or join us in a conversation or join us thinking about. And that's not to say every show is super political necessarily, but it's just really about kind of expressing, it's from a very basic sense, expressing sort of who we are regionally. I think, when I said I didn't tell people I was Bahamian, the vision people have of our region is very flat and very tied to tourism and very far from what our reality on the ground is. So I think we're interested in showing who we are and showing what our experiences are. And I think all our curatorial choices really come from that standpoint of this is what it means to be a Caribbean woman, a Caribbean man. And then, of course, just in showing the world that we, again, are capable of excellence, which sounds very sort of facile in a way. But again, normally when I tell people I'm from the Bahamas, they say something about the swimming pigs. That's what they think about when they think about the Bahamas. They think about the swimming pigs. And maybe if it's not swimming pigs, it's like a Bahama mama salt shaker or something. And I'm just like, no, I'm sorry. No. And so I feel like we are very proud and we want to show people how complex we are, how smart we are, how, what goes on here that's beyond that, that's real. When the Bahamas had a pavilion at the Venice Biennial in 2013, the artist Tabara Strong did it, who's an incredible Bahamian artist. And, people were coming out of that and they were saying, wow, Amanda, that was so interesting. But it was so conceptual. And I'd be like, yeah, we have concepts too, So we actually made T-shirts in the galleries. We had T-shirts that say the Caribbean has concepts too. So I think our curatorial choices are about, excuse me for my language, but fuck you. We actually also are capable of this shit. We also think deep thoughts and we have conceptual art. And I think all of our choices are really kind of a bit like giving the finger to the rest of the world.
If they don't give you respect, you take it.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So we're really looking for excellence, for people that are really just great at their craft and just, really have something to say. But all really very much tied to, again, Caribbean-ness.
So what are you excited about right now?
Oh my God, everything. Everything. What am I excited about right now? I'm excited we're going to be 5 at the end of the year and we're still in business. I'm excited about that. There's actually a kind of like plan cooking to try to make another Venice Biennale pavilion happen here, which I think would be great. There's a lot happening. And I'm excited beyond, I think I'm excited about the whole region in general. And I sort of, because I guess I came from the institution, I never just think about the gallery. And I am a great believer in rising tides float all boats. There's a little art fair that's happening down here now, which is being operated by another entity. And I'm very excited about that because I feel like when people start to come to the region to look for culture, that's something that, hasn't happened in a long time. We had an amazing music industry in the 50s, 40s, 50s, and 60s in the Bahamas. People flew from all over the world to come here for all of our nightclubs and all the musicians. And that stopped. That just stopped in the 80s. And so I'm excited about the future of the region and how the region itself is just kind of like taking back control, trying to wrest some of its own narrative from the tourism giants and trying to kind of create much more authentic spaces. I'm excited about that. I'm excited to be home, to be in the Bahamas. I've been back home 12 years and everyone keeps asking me when I'm going to move back to New York or move back to civilization. And I'm like, no, man, I'm here.
Yeah.
This is where it's happening.
Yeah.
So I'm not excited about the state of the world in general. So I guess I am kind of excited to stay in my island.
I don't blame you.
Yeah. So I think there's a lot to be excited about as well as there's a lot to be depressed about. So I do try to focus on those things. I think it's changed a lot. When I moved home, I told people I am moving to the Bahamas to run the museum. And the answer generally was, oh, there's art there? I know, right? It's funny, but it's also like, there's human beings there. So yes, there's art, but of course it was a condescending question. But now people are really like, oh, that's, Caribbean art, Jamaican art, or Reuben art, whatever it is. Obviously Cuba's been on the map a long time, but I think people are beginning to take it all a bit more seriously. And I think that's great. I'm excited for the artists coming up now. I'm excited for a lot of the artists, not only in our program, but other artists from the region that are doing so well. So I think there's a lot to be excited about if you're from the region.
That's great. I've really enjoyed our conversation. This is going to be our last question. As a gallery owner, how do you want to impact the art world? What do you feel is your role?
That's a good question. I think first and foremost is to support the artists that we work with. First and foremost, I think we do look at I think there's a lot of galleries doing this now. The model's still pretty much the same model, but we're thinking about how do we change it internally. Again, to be more equitable, we're paying everyone health insurance. We're paying everyone a proper salary. We're not asking people to work for free. I think there is some education of collectors that has to be done as well. I think the model that, someone with a massive collection is going to come in and hammer you down to a discount that you can barely afford to pay the rent is changing slowly. So I think like more equity in the art market is something that is important for us as a young gallery representing largely artists of color, even though not all, of course. So I think we're just trying to escape the model of the gallery where you kind of have ownership somehow over, the people you work with. I think it's much more of so I think it's about changing the way the gallery artist relationship is seen and is felt, and the collector gallery relationship where everyone's sort of working together. It sounds very idealistic, but I think being more sustainable and just in our practices. So, most of the artists we work with, we have very open relationships with. They have other galleries. We work with the other galleries very openly. It's not that old model where it's kind of like everything comes to me. I own it all, I think there's much more letting the artist lead, having them be clear about how they want you to speak about the work. So I think that's sort of the role. It's like that idea of like the evil, galleries are all evil. They're in it for the money. And I think that's changing. I think everyone's saying that it's an ecosystem. We all need each other. We all need, we need museums, we need galleries, we need artists. Some artists don't want to work with a gallery, and that's fine too. Some will work with an agent, some will work on their own and just have an assistant who handles everything for them. So I think it's really just kind of being open as a gallery now, working today is like, how do we create a space that's the most equitable it can be, where everyone is being supported from the people working with us within the gallery space itself? How are we supporting them in their growth and professionalization? How are we supporting our artists? And how are we changing that model so that it really is a model that we feed each other, that we really support each other and nourish each other, and it's a partnership.
Well, thank you for all you do. And the work you do is important and it's needed.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you. It's delightful to feature you. Thank you for listening to Cerebral Women Art Talks podcast. For additional content, please visit cerebralwomen.com and be sure to follow Cerebral Women on Instagram.